Welcome to the InfoSec Insider podcast, brought to you by URM, the UK's leading information and cybersecurity specialists.
Hi, my name's Annie and I'm joined here today by Wayne Armstrong, who's one of our senior consultants here at URM. Welcome to another episode of InfoSec Insider. So today Wayne and I are going to be discussing some common pitfalls and challenges that organisations face in relation to ISO 27001, which is the International Standard for Information Security Management Systems, or ISMSs. So Wayne, just to start us off, can you talk about what common mistakes should organisations avoid whilst implementing ISO 27001 before their certification assessment?
I think probably the main thing is that a lot of organisations that I come across probably don't really know why they're doing it in the first place. So having a good understanding of the reasons why you're implementing an ISMS or needing to gain certification to 27001 is a good place to start. And I think a lot of organizations miss that element. They try and dive straight into implementing controls and things like that without sort of realizing actually what they need. So if you look at the standard, it kind of gives you a clue as to, at least in the early stages anyway, when you're implementing an ISMS for the first time, it gives you a clue in terms of what the order of events should be. So in clause 4, it talks about context of the organization. So it's understanding what your requirements are for information security. And that could come from a number of different places. It could be business reasons, it could be contractual reasons with regard to your customers, etc. And taking into consideration the needs and expectations of those internal and external interested parties is the perfect place to start, because then that enables you to realize, well, this is why I'm doing information security in the first place. So once you've got that information, you can then move on to doing things like setting a few high-level objectives and performing risk assessments. And then once you've got the output from the risk assessments and you know what some of your objectives are, you can start to prioritize some of the other tasks that you need to do to implement a successful ISMS, such as creating documentation, conducting training and awareness, implementing those technical controls, etc. But the key thing is there, rather than diving straight into putting controls in place, at least now we know, because of the objectives and the information provided by our interested parties and the information provided by our risk assessments, we know which technical controls are important. And so I think to answer that question, I think there's one big thing really, and that's to ensure that you do things for the right reasons and do them in the right order. So that's one thing. The other main thing to mention is that during the assessment, obviously the assessor will need to see evidence that you've got an ISMS in place. Typically an assessment is split into 2 stages. So at stage 1, the assessor is going to want to see that you have sufficiently well-designed ISMS based on the things I've just been talking about around context and risk and things like that, to indicate that your ISMS is fit for purpose. And then later on at stage 2, they'll need to see examples of evidence to show that the ISMS is actually working. So some examples would include, so at stage 1, an assessor is likely to want to see that you understand what internal auditing is all about, probably have a documented internal audit methodology, and probably have a schedule in place to show when internal audits are going to take place. At stage 2, you'll need to have some evidence that internal audits have happened. Another example, at stage 1, you'll need a methodology around performing risk assessments. At stage 2, you need to show evidence that risk assessments have been completed and that certain mandatory documentation is in place, such as your statement of applicability and the risk treatment plan, etc. And a third example, probably around the monitoring and measuring thing. So at stage 1, you should have a plan and an understanding of what you're going to monitor and measure that will show that the ISMS is working as expected. And then at stage 2, obviously, you're going to actually show the results of the monitoring and measuring to the assessor. So I think in terms of pitfalls to avoid before you go for certification in the first place. It's knowledge and awareness of what the evidence needs to be to ensure that you successfully complete stages 1 and 2 of the assessment.
So just following on from that, once an organisation is certified, are there any mistakes you regularly see while they're trying to maintain their ISMS and their certification?
Yeah, I think there's probably one really that is kind of worth talking about, which is a big one, to be honest, and encapsulates a number of things. And the key word is within your question is maintaining. So I think one of the things that could happen with some organizations is that they're putting all of this time and effort and money, etc., into implementing an ISMS in the first place. And then they get certified, and so everybody goes off and celebrates, and then they take the foot off the gas and they forget all about it for several months. And then the next thing they realize is the assessor's coming back 12 months later to do a continual assessment visit, and they've suddenly realized they've got no evidence to show the assessor that things like internal audits and monitoring and measuring, like I've just been mentioning, is still happening. And so staying on top of those operational processes is key, and having, sort of milestones or checkpoints in place throughout the year that says that certain things need to be done at a certain time. So examples would be risk assessments, internal audits, the monitoring and measuring, ensuring that those things are done, and that you update the documentation or the records to show, what the monitoring and measuring results are. Reviewing documents. Most organizations will have something in their policies that says we'll review our policy and procedure documents probably on an annual basis, something like that. It's one of the things that tends to fall by the wayside. Organizations tend to forget to review those things. So stick it in a calendar somewhere and ensure that you perform those reviews. Management review is another thing as well, not necessarily because you forget to do it, but one of the problems is around who needs to be involved in management review, because it's all about top management in the organization looking at sort of a summary of all the things that's been going on in the previous 12 months to determine whether the ISMS is working as expected. But in lots of organizations, it's really difficult to get into top management diaries and get them all together into a room for a meeting to discuss information security for a couple of hours. So sometimes you might have to be creative around how management reviews can be performed. There's no requirement in the standard for a meeting. You can do it in a number of different ways. The information security manager, for example, could have one-to-ones with those managers and work through the different subjects that need to be covered during management review. And so I think that's a sort of not a pitfall, but a challenge to overcome in terms of ensuring that management reviews are undertaken correctly and in time.
With the new version of ISO 27001, have you noticed any sort of new challenges or pitfalls that organizations are making?
Yeah, and I think this might come out of left field a little bit, but it's not necessarily the changes, or as far as my first answer is concerned, it's not necessarily the changes to ISO 27001 that you necessarily need to be aware of, although there are some changes in there that you need to be aware of. I think one of the things that might get missed by some organizations is that they're not aware of the changes to ISO 27002, which is the best practice guidance document that describes all of the best practice associated with the 93 technical controls in Annex A of 27001. And there's been a significant update to a lot of the guidance in that standard. And so I think organizations potentially are going to miss a trick because they don't necessarily take into consideration the updates to the guidance when they go on and perform future risk assessments, etc., because they may be measuring their control maturity as part of the risk assessment without having all the facts, if you know what I mean, because they've not taken into consideration those changes to the guidance. I think there's a couple of things as well within the mandatory clauses within 27001. So one of the things that springs to mind is within clause 4.4. There's a subtle change in there that talks about processes, operational processes, and their interactions. So whilst previously I think organisations, both during their internal audits and during their assessments, have kind of got away with it to a certain degree with regard to clause 4.4, because we've never really tended to look too closely at that clause. So what's happened is that because it's kind of a summary of the whole ISMS, it requires you to have implemented and be operating and maintaining and continually improving an ISMS. Because you audit all of the rest of the clauses, you kind of come to the conclusion that, well, if everything else is in place and working, then 4.4 must automatically be met. And that, I think, still holds true to a certain degree. However, this new bit that they've added in around processes in their interactions, I think at least means that someone from the organization that's talking to an assessor needs to be able to describe how the ISMS works and how the different operational processes required by the ISMS interact with each other. In that, there are going to be outputs from some processes that form the input into other processes and so on. And so the ability to be able to describe that is going to be something I think that will come up in interviews with assessors. Also, there's another sort of subtle change in clause 8.1, which talks about the operational processes and it essentially says, go out and do the things that you've planned to do in clause 6, things like objectives, setting objectives, risk management, etc. That clause now says, clause 8.1 now says that you must have defined the criteria by which those processes are enacted. And the idea of that, I think, is essentially to ensure that every time you perform a risk assessment, for example, it's done in exactly the same way so that the outputs can be compared with each other. You're comparing apples with apples kind of thing. It refers back to clause 6. So it follows that you should have those criteria defined for setting objectives, for performing risk management activities, and for performing change management as well. And then one final thing on that question, it's not necessarily a pitfall, but for some organizations, they may have missed the boat here to a certain degree, but some organizations might miss an opportunity here in that there is a new clause that's been added into the standard, a mandatory clause, which is clause 6.3, which requires that changes to the ISMS need to be formally managed. So you've got to have some kind of change management process in place to manage your ISMS. And what I mean by an opportunity missed is that obviously organizations are wanting to transition from the 2013 version of ISO 27001 to the 2022 version of ISO 27001. And obviously there's a number of things that need to change within the ISMS to enable that to happen. Well, if that's the case, it's the perfect thing to run through that change management process and thereby generate evidence to show an assessor. So I've been saying to clients that probably one of the first things that they should do is ensure that they've got a process in place for 6.3, because then everything else that follows can be put through that process and we automatically meet the requirement.
So just to finish off, Wayne, could you give an example of industry or sector specific pitfalls and challenges organisations from particular industries should look out for when implementing ISO 27001?
Yeah, I'm not going to pick on any specific industry, but I think one of the main things is, and I come across this quite a lot, that organisations are not really aware of what the expectations are by regulators, for example. So not all industries are regulated. But for those industries that are, or maybe they're providing services to clients who are working in a regulated industry, a lot of times those regulations are going to have some kind of interest in information security. And so I think one of the things that organizations miss is what the requirements are of the regulations. And so going all the way back to clause 4 that we talked about at the beginning of the podcast, understanding the needs and expectations and your operational context is really key to ensuring that your ISMS is working as expected. Part of that is understanding the legislative requirements, but also the regulatory requirements and contractual requirements that regulators and clients might have with regard to you managing their information effectively or meeting the regulations. So I think the key thing is to go out there and find out, are there any regulations that are relevant? And if so, what do those regulations say? And what am I going to do about it? And I've got another thing to just mention here as well. It's not really a pitfall or a challenge or anything like that, but I think it's more a kind of maybe a tip with regard to overcoming some of those challenges. And that's for organizations to reach out to other organizations that they would normally consider to be competitors, but for the purposes of information security and meeting regulations and that kind of thing, it's sometimes an advantage to reach out to peer organizations and asking them, well, what do you do in order to meet these regulations and these expectations? So an example of what I mean is with regard to the insurance industry. Insurance companies share intelligence with regard to ensuring that they can try and combat claims fraud. And so from an information security point of view, there's no reason why you can't do the same thing. Share intelligence between you as organizations to ensure that the whole industry improves the way that it treats its information and ensures that the requirements of those regulations and their customer expectations are all met.
I suppose that's going to be a massively important one for organisations in very heavily regulated industries, isn't it?
Yeah, so the health industry, for example, the finance industry, even things like the construction industry. So from a health and safety point of view, this might sound a bit far-fetched, but we've seen this in action where, if you don't protect certain types of information, and in this case, the integrity of information to ensure that information's accurate and it's up to date, etc. When you're building bridges or you've got people out there working in dangerous situations, if the information is incorrect, that could cause significant issues for organizations. So there's a number of different organizations that would benefit from researching, what the requirements are in legislation, regulations, customer requirements, etc., and then ensuring that those things are met within the ISMS.
Well, thank you very, very much, Wayne, for taking the time out to sit and chat to me today. And for anyone that wants to know a bit more about the pitfalls associated with ISO 27001, we've got a really great blog on our website, urmconsulting.com, which is called Common Pitfalls Identified in Organisations Seeking ISO 27001 Certification. And I think it was you who wrote that one, Wayne. I'm pretty sure.
I can't remember. I've written a few. Yeah, possibly.
You've written quite a few for us. So yeah, I definitely recommend going and checking that one out because Wayne goes into quite a few other pitfalls to avoid there as well. So thank you very much, Wayne, and thanks for listening. If you've enjoyed this podcast, we would really appreciate it if you could spare a moment to leave a rating or review at ratethispodcast.com/InfoSec Insider. To listen to more episodes, you can find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, and Podbean.
Thank you for listening to URM's InfoSec Insider podcast. For more information, visit our website at urmconsulting.com.